Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me again today. Today we have Tay. She is my friend and my coworker. Tay, do you want to present yourself and just introduce yourself and what you like to do?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tay. As Carolina mentioned, I work at Meow Wolf. I am a security officer, and I'm also a master's student in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado at Denver. And when I'm not in school or at work, I enjoy spending time outside, which includes doing yoga outside. I do flow art, so like sort of like dance, and I enjoy writing as well.
Nice. So I asked Tay to come in today to kind of pose the question of how has no, colonization and capitalism has affected your environment and the nature surrounding you. So you can do a either or question or kind of just mix in both and answer them that way.
Awesome. Well, I definitely think most directly capitalism, which I see sort of as a result of colonialism, they're very closely connected. There's been sort of a cost barrier that's sort of been put up for using the outdoors, even though that's something that traditionally people all over the world have had direct access to before colonialism. Now it's something where you have to have resources to be able to utilize the resources we have in nature.
So can you expand a little bit about that, like the use of resources outdoors and just being outdoors?
Well, being outdoors used to be integrated into the lifestyle in pretty much every part of the world. Whereas these days, I live in an apartment. And so I don't even have an amount of open space to use as a yard. And even if I did live in a house with a yard, it didn't used to be that I had to live in a house on a lot, on a parcel of land that somebody owned to be connected to nature. I used to be able to just go outside and be in nature, depending on where I was living. Nowadays, it's something you sort of have to pay to have access to. I'd say the same is the case for recreational activities. In Colorado, the example I could think of skiing, which, hundreds of years ago in certain parts of the world, people used to just have skis as transportation. These days, it's a recreational activity. You have to pay for a pass to go. You have to either buy or rent gear. You have to pay for lessons to learn. And so it's just not something that's available to all people. Of course, I grew up in a different part of the US that's in a subtropical climate. So that's not something I would have grown up doing. I do even meet people within Colorado who tell me the same thing, though, where even though that's a big part of the state culture here, that's not something they really ever had the access to do.
Right. And I imagine that those people, and like me, I've only done it once. It's too expensive for it to
Yeah.
be like sustainable.
Exactly. And that's something where I guess, there was always probably the cost involved of buying skis, but like I think of just like Scandinavia back in the day where people used to actually use it as a form of transportation. It's become something that's commodified. And even something like hiking, which in theory you don't really have to pay for, there's sort of a cost and a cultural barrier present there because we've made it to where you have hiking boots. Most shoes that we wear aren't really great to wear hiking. We now sell hiking boots and hiking clothing that's moisture wicking and all that jazz. You have to pay to use a park, and the fee's usually not that high. But that's someone like me saying it. I am fairly privileged and I don't have any children. If you don't have a car, which I don't, it's a lot harder to even go hiking because you have to drive to the park or the place that you want to hike. There's not really public transit available to take those of us that live in urban dwellings to more natural settings. So even with something like hiking or camping, which you have to buy gear for, there's been this cost barrier that wasn't really present before colonialism and capitalism that's been put in place for really all sorts of activities.
Have you heard of the leave no trace like principles?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so there's this article that one of my professors actually wrote. If you've heard of Gregory Simon, yeah.
Um,
Um,
who's
no.
Gregory Simon?
Oh, he's one of my professors. He wrote an article basically contradicting the seven principles that leave no trace. Is basically publicizing to the people. So basically, leave no trace. It has the seven principles of, being out in nature, respecting nature, picking up whatever you left off, basically going into nature and then not leaving anything behind you that indicated that you were there. But those seven principles don't account for basically the money that needs to be spent in order to be in nature. So what I
Yeah.
mean by that, yeah, it's like your camping gear, the newest edition of some jacket that's supposed to keep you warm with only one layer on, and like these boots and like everything else. And it doesn't come into the account of creating that sustainable way of going into nature, because you essentially have to buy into the products of like REI, and like all these other companies that just keep producing these products in order for people to feel like they are accepted within this community
Mhm.
of being in nature.
And that's really interesting. So I grew up in South Carolina. Again, it's very warm. When I was in middle and high school, those North Face fleece jackets were super, super popular. And it became almost sort of like a status. I mean, it was a status symbol thing because it's South Carolina. It doesn't get that cold. You don't need a jacket that much of the time, especially not something like the North Face, which originally was marketed for being outdoors gear. And I mean, you have the North Face is just the most obvious example, but like Patagonia, Columbia, all of these products, they tend to be on the pricier end. And you can find discounted hiking gear or like off-brand stuff a lot of times that involves supporting companies like Amazon, which of course is a connected but separate issue. And you can buy these, but are they going to be as reliable as the name brand products? And then even so, if you're someone that considers yourself outdoorsy, are your friends going to not judge you on it, but react to it a certain way that isn't favorable? So it's become kind of ridiculous how we've commodified being outdoors as another niche that we can market for.
And I feel like that's just like one little aspect of the whole realm of capitalism.
Yeah.
How we literally commodify everything that we own and that we use like in a day-to-day basis. Um, and it kind of just brings us back to the topic of like colonialism and how capitalism is so deeply rooted out of colonialism. Because like if you really think about it, all of these like brands and like these big corporations are just finding a way to control us.
Yeah. And pretty much cut off access to things that we ultimately like. I think all people that are born have a right to access the land that is, in the proximity of where they're born. And I understand that maybe that idea has kind of been warped into manifest destiny, which caused colonialism or encouraged it at least. But I do like to think that all of us, just as humans, have an inherent right to be able to use land, not to exploit it necessarily or cause harm to it, but to be able to develop a relationship with it and utilize its resources in a responsible way. And that's just been really stripped away from, like, honestly, most people, especially marginalized communities. I know when I first moved to Denver about 5 or 6 years ago, I did City Year, which is an AmeriCorps program, and we're placed in schools that are considered to have high proportions of at-risk students, so students facing a lot of social inequities. Particularly, most of the kids I worked with, they were from immigrant communities, lots of English as a second language students, but brilliant, wonderful middle school kids, but so many of them had never been hiking before. Like, we took them to Genesee state park. I don't know if it's a state park or it's Genesee Park, but they have a ropes course. I'm not sure if that's something that we as a school had to pay to use, but it was something we at least had to arrange sort of as a field trip. And this was, and mind you, these kids were probably like 11, 12, 13. This was like the first time a lot of these kids, many of who grew up in Colorado, had really been like in a state or a local park and gone hiking and did some of these outdoor activities. And it just kind of illustrates that there really is like, there's a cost barrier, there's sort of culture barrier, because outdoor activities is stereotyped as something that more affluent, more white people do. It's created sort of this barrier to where like a lot of these kids have never done this before. And I remember it blew my mind because I had only lived in Colorado for a few months and I had already been to see the Maroon Bells and done a couple of hiking trips with friends that had cars. So yeah, it's capitalism and colonialism. They've sort of separated all of us, most of us except the very wealthy, away from nature, but there are certain communities that are impacted by it more than others.
It's ironic that you say that, how outdoors is really presented to more of like a wealthy, like dominantly white community. Literally, I think it was like 2 or 3 days ago, I saw an Instagram ad for North Face, and it was basically a Latina woman presenting like a North Face jacket, and basically her saying that we Latinos can finally go outdoors. And I'm like, what? Did we not go outdoors before?
Right.
And I was just like, this is so weird. Like, so
And we
it just
see
brings.
this, we're seeing this, and it's not just like in the environmental, like in the context of like products marketed for like the outdoor niche. I think companies are doing this. They think it's really clever thing where they exploit concern for legitimate social issues, human rights issues, but they exploit them to sell their product. And that's pretty much what they're doing. It's like, okay, but like, how are you actually going to create more access to nature? Are you actually going to make your products accessible for the majority of people to buy? Because they're pretty expensive. Are you going to be actually putting any money into initiatives to increase access to outdoor spaces? Or are you just sort of using this to sell products to a wider range of people? And I guess maybe it sounds cynical, but I kind of think in a lot of cases it's the last part.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like I think of it as a way of for them to include like the other wide range of community, but it's also a way of like bringing in colonialism.
Yeah.
And again, like that erasure of culture, because it's just like it just brings me back to like that Instagram ad that I saw. It's like we were already outdoors. We were I feel like a lot of marginalized communities appreciate nature in a different way than wealthier and white dominant communities. So it's just like, I don't know. I feel that ad just rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is just like the lack of sincerity too. Like, and yeah, it doesn't, and also it just like the phrasing of it's offensive, and it's like that doesn't actually really do anything to erase the barriers that are in place that weren't always in place to accessing outdoor spaces.
Yeah. So I want to ask, what's some of your experiences with colonialization and capitalism?
Well, it's, we both work at Meow Wolf. I would consider myself a pretty working class person. I would say I grew up maybe slightly like a little more privileged, middle class. But now, I live paycheck to paycheck. And yeah, I certainly don't have the money to go on backpacking trips in South America. That's not, I'd probably, and I'm using that as an example because that's something I hear a lot about, like, like young college kids going to do is, oh, I'm going to go on a backpacking trip to like Machu Picchu or, somewhere in Europe. And it's like, that's just not something I've ever had the access to go do. And it's sort of, a lot of our social capital is built on the things that we have done, the experiences that we've accumulated. And so it's like, oh, well, she doesn't travel or do this or do that. She must be, it makes you look uncultured or unworldly or something like that. And it's like, no, I literally just cannot afford to do that. And I think that would probably, like, skiing, snowboarding, I tried it once, and yeah, it was like, I even had that thought. I was like, how do people just afford to like do this all the time? Yeah, it's something, because I have to work the majority of my time, that's less time like available that I could be spending even just exploring the outdoors of Colorado. I also don't drive, like I don't own a car, so that significantly impacts just like my ability to go really enjoy the outdoors. So I don't know if that really answers the question, because I mean, I think pretty much all of us except the very, very, very rich are impacted by capitalism, and they're the ones that kind of perpetuate it, so I guess they're affected too. But yeah, I consider myself to be not a normal person, but just like another piece in America's very large working class. And yeah, I don't have the time, energy, or resources to really develop as strong of a connection with nature as I'd like to.
Yeah. And I wish we did. Like, it sucks because, you feel like you're in this endless cycle in regards to capitalism. You feel like you're just stuck, like
Yeah.
working and not ever, getting enough money to actually save or
Mhm.
afford to do the stuff that you actually want to go do. And it's like capitalism exploits us as a resource, and it also exploits nature as a resource. Whichever one it could get its hand on, like, more, it'll do. And I feel like that's what these corporations are always benefiting from. They're always like, okay, which one can I exploit more so I can get the most amount of profit and
Yeah.
not give back to those people or nature?
And kind of on that note, a lot of times when we talk about just more sustainable practice, a lot of that discourse is focused around individuals. It's like, oh, well, if you buy like a reusable grocery bag, or if you use a reusable water bottle. And I'm not saying those things don't create any impact at all, but I feel like where we really need to be focusing our attention is to the like multi-billion-dollar corporations that really could afford to be following more sustainable practices. Like, okay, like if you've ever ordered something off of Amazon and the amount of packaging they use, why aren't we holding them to a higher standard of developing a method to ship things safely using less cardboard and plastic? Like, why aren't we hitting them with higher tax rate? We can afford these large corporations, they can afford to be taxed more and regulated more heavily, and they would still be fine as companies. We're not holding them accountable, and we're making it look like it's up to the individual when most of the damage that's occurring is because of these large scale capitalistic operations.
Yeah. It's like, just to go off of like what you're saying, we're never ever solving the problem at the root.
Yeah.
We're always trying to like make short-term goals, make short-term resolutions for these big like corporations to still input so much carbon. And even with have you heard of carbon offsetting?
Explain it to me. I have heard of it. I don't know much about it.
So carbon offsetting is a way for corporations to buy carbon credits and basically release their debts to some other land resource. So what I
Yeah.
mean by that is carbon credits, they buy these carbon credits in order to have their big corporations release X amount of carbon into the environment, while they're also having a side project that was either approved by whatever government or whatever regulator said, okay, now go do restoration on X land over here.
Mm-hmm.
And in the reality of that, yeah, they're doing the restoration, or maybe they're not, but are they actually being regulated to the point of them restoring of what they're off-putting in carbon in their big industry? You know, it's like, and it's like things like,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's things like that that go back to capitalism, because in order for them to do that whole cycle, they have to put in X amount of money into this land and buy X amount of credits in order to make it seem like a carbon offset. Um, so yeah.
So pretty much if you have enough money, you can pollute as much as you want. You just have to pay the money to, yeah. And I think that's an excellent point, is it makes it look like they're doing something good. One, some of these corporations should probably be doing that sort of PR without having to, because they already cause so much damage regardless of whether they're buying those credits. But it makes it look like they're doing a good thing when in reality it might not actually be making up for the amount that they are putting into the atmosphere.
Yeah. And it's like some of these like corporations in general aren't even getting regulated for like carcinogens being put in the groundwater and in the soils. And it's just like it comes to a point where it leads to like environmental injustice as well. If say like these corporations are near a community, and usually this happens like near communities of like marginalized people, mainly like Black and people of color, like these oil refineries and like these chemical plants are always placed in these communities, and these communities always end up getting many diseases because of the toxins being released either in the air or in the soil, and it leaches off into the groundwater and into the water in general.
Yeah, and that's like, and I know that it's a different cause, but I keep like thinking of Flint, Michigan, and just how like literally every child in that town has elevated levels of lead in their blood. And I guess I bring that up to show like it really does impact entire communities, and it can affect, I mean, honestly, like having any sort of like toxin, and I mean that word like seriously, like lead in your bloodstream, it affects your school performance, it affects your overall health, your cognition, like I said, school performance, your emotional health, it can stunt development. And it's horrible when it happens on an individual level too, but these are literally entire like townfuls of people that can feel the impact of this sort of damage.
It's not like Michigan has dealing plus years, right? There's something timeline.
Sorry, it's the recording skipping out a bit, but it's been going on for a while, and I think that like there's still lead in the drinking water. It's been at least a decade.
What do they have? People have in their blood for cause a substantial change in order for them to revert the like I don't get it.
Your mic is cutting out a little bit, like it's in and out. It's interesting, it's skipping a lot. It might be like if you have your headphones in. Yeah, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It was like doing the little kind of noises, like trust me, I've had these problems before too.
Now I can't hear you. Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's I still struggle with that, so I understand.
So what were you I was talking about like how it's been a very long period of time that Flint, Michigan has been dealing with this water crisis, and how
Hmm.
like how many individuals have to have like blood in their system, not blood, lead in their system for it to actually make a substantial change. You know, like it just reminds me of this other article that I read, and it was about um a majority black community in Gracefield, Pennsylvania, where they had an oil refinery like maybe like 2 miles of a radius from their community. And this oil refinery, it was not being regulated for over like ten years, and they had like over the top benzene and carcinogen chemical levels,
Wow.
yeah, going off into the groundwater and the soil and the air around them. And like all the people in the community were getting like asthma and like cancers. They were getting it like at such younger ages than like regularly in like the United States. And it didn't come up into like the media until this refinery exploded because of I don't know what they were doing for it to have been caused to explode. But even then, like this was during like the Trump administration, and Trump was like, no, like let's just rebuild this refinery and then we can get it going again. And everyone was like, what? And it became like this whole issue of the people of the community fighting against like the Trump administration or whatever Trump official was put to basically fight the community and the workers that were involved in this refinery as well, because the workers were thinking about like, oh, how am I going to survive if I don't have a job, and think
Yeah.
that, while the community was like, well, how are we going to survive if we keep getting sick?
Yeah, and how many towns like that, or like Flint, like how many communities are there actually out in the United States where this is actually a reality, where a large proportion of the residents are essentially getting poisoned due to just poor decisions on the part of their local and state governments, lack of regulation, old infrastructure. I really do wonder how many communities are like that, and what do most of those communities look like? Because you'll see a lot of people tend to support things until like, oh, it's near me. You know what, like the not in my backyard sort of sentiment. It's like I think we have a Superfund site where like they store like nuclear waste, like somewhere, I want to say it's maybe around like Globeville or Commerce City. And it's like, of course we're going to put it over there where like property values are lower. um it's We're not going to put it in Cherry Creek, like in the Cherry Creek neighborhood, which has higher average income than most of Denver. It's so, I'm sure if you asked a lot of people, do you want to put like an unregulated oil refinery or a Superfund site or some sort of environmental hazard, if they thought I could stimulate the economy, they'd be cool with it until it was like in proximity to them. People tend to feel a lot different when it's something that doesn't directly impact them. And it tends to be put in places where people have less power. They have less resources and less direct like political power to actually make anything change, or to be able to fight against placing something like that there. They might not even know it's happening too.
All of those are so true. And it leads me back to how we as a community, like we sometimes don't, like what you're saying, like if it doesn't happen to us personally, we don't take action because of it. And it leads me back to thinking of like indigenous practices, how when even like today, they still act like a very knit community. Like they care about their people, they try to uplift their people, they
Mm-hmm.
uplift their people. And it's like in America, we don't really have that unless it's like
Yeah.
our own little circle of friends. But in reality, like when these communities are suffering, like we as a people should be trying to help them. And it's like another term, praxis,
Yes.
Praxis, not CS.
it's like our beliefs and how we are going to connect our beliefs into like the outside world and like our workplace, our school place, and how, we are going to actually contribute to our own beliefs and actually work to uplift our beliefs. And it's just like it gets me thinking about just how we need to care more.
I agree. I think so much of the American psyche is like centered around this like hyper individualistic thing, like this hyper freedom. Like personal freedom is a lot of people in the United States like most solid like important value. And I think there needs to be more of a realization that we can be individualistic while also caring about other individuals and other groups of people, because all of us, unless you live truly off grid, all of us are dependent on society and one another for something or else. Like I take the bus to work. That is a public service that I use. I pay taxes on my income that help fund things like taking the bus. The food I eat is grown from other people and then sent to a grocery store where it is sold by a business. I depend both on the farmers and the grocery store to get that food. The grocery store and the farmers depend on us spending money. So what I'm saying is that we as humans, we're in our own little ecosystem. And I don't think we realize that, where even if you're a relatively independent person, you're still depending on other people in one way or another. And I think we've sort of forgotten that we live like in a reciprocal, like interdependent ecosystem, and that when we interact with that world, it interacts with us back. I think we've really forgotten that, and it gives us the excuse to not care about things like climate change or like pollution in communities that don't immediately like affect us. We have just sort of gotten really selfish, and it's sort of under the guise of the concept of like personal freedom.
He has and like I feel like that's like one thing that capitalism does to us, because it puts us like in competition with each other in a way.
Yeah.
And we forget that people, like people in general, are our community. Regardless if you hate people or not, we have to work together in a sense. And I feel like we have forgotten that too. And we've also have forgotten that like non-human beings, when I refer to that as like animals too, are part of our community. And we've kind of like done this hierarchy where we've put people on a pedestal, and everything else is below us. And we don't think of animals as beings. Like they don't have rights in most states or countries. I think the only country right now is Ecuador that recently passed a law where animals have rights like people do. So
that's interesting. Yeah, it's like, okay, you could buy insurance for your pet, but you don't understand that like that animals are living creatures too.
Yeah, like they feel things, like, and like they understand different senses and stuff. Like, I feel like we take animals a lot for our own advantage, and like zoos and like aquariums, and for our own like materialistic pleasures.
Yeah, and it's and I'm not a vegetarian, I do eat meat, but like if you think about just like our farming system, because we've domesticated entire species, we don't really think about taking care of non-domesticated species, because we've bred cows to serve us, so who cares about bison, like, or water buffalo or something that actually naturally exists and wasn't bred specifically for the purpose of agriculture. So we've come, and same with pets, we've domesticated pets. And I think a lot of us subconsciously have separated like the animals that we've domesticated that serve a purpose for us from wild animals.
Yeah,
so we've It's like the mental gymnastics we sort of play to excuse our behavior.
Well, I think we have talked a lot.
Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to add or say that we didn't talk about?
I guess something just that what I would like to see more of an effort from companies like Patagonia and the North Face is thinking about ways to actually increase access beyond using advertisements that feature more diverse populations. Like, how can you actually increase access to the outdoors and be more inclusive besides things that seem like just very thin marketing ploys to me?
I feel like, if we had the right people, or, maybe they do have the right people in place for those types of things, but I feel like they are trying to reach to a certain community, which they feel that wouldn't, it would kind of backfire.
Yeah.
Way. So I don't know. I feel like they should just reconstruct their whole entire system.
I think so too. I think it's got to be something that really happens outside of any one entity, sector of the economy, public or private sector. It's really, it has to be a systemic change. I do agree with that. So we'll see. Well, thank you, Carolina. Good luck with the rest of your project.
Thank you as well, like for all your insights and like participation. Like this was like really cool, and I'm going to stop recording.